Now on the screen, we are in the final section of this outline, verses, Paul's preaching after his conversion. Paul challenges Agrippa. That is where we are in the final section. Paul challenges Agrippa. And so it's been 2 weeks since last I spoke, and so I didn't know, I had to go back and watch the video to see where I finished, and so I want to kind of backtrack. I remember the last thing I was discussing was verse number 28. Then Agrippa said unto Paul, "Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian." And Greg had made a comment right before the bell. It seems like everybody makes comments right before the bell. It's like they're waiting right until that last 5 minutes, and we're going to take that last 5 minutes. Now, that's fine. But in the last few minutes, Greg spoke about this, about whether or not, he mentioned whether or not Agrippa said what he said, whether he was being sarcastic or whether he was being serious. And so I decided to go back and put a little bit of time into that question, and we'll discuss that in a moment. But as I started to study for that, I was trying to get my mind back into the groove of things, and I decided to go back and deal with something a little bit clearer as well. If you'd look at verse number 27. King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? I know that thou believest. Now, Paul specifically referenced, when he said, believest thou the prophets, Paul had just a few verses previous to this, verse 22 and 23, Paul had mentioned some prophets. And so, I want to go back to verse 22 and 23 in light of that, and read that, and share with you some more research I did on this. Having therefore obtained help of God, I continue unto this day, witnessing both to small and great, saying unto the things than those which the prophets and Moses did say should come. And so that's what I want to share with you, some of the things that the prophets and Moses said. And notice there he says some things that they said should come, and that Christ should suffer, and that he should rise from the dead, and that he should show light unto the people and to the Gentiles. And so there's 4 different categories of things that Paul mentions there that the prophets and or Moses mentioned. And so that's what I wanted to just go a little bit deeper with that. The Old Testament prophets, including Moses, they did affirm all these things concerning Christ, and I didn't dare try to include every scripture reference I could find, because I'm sure there's numerous ones, but I did want to include just a few of them. In relation to that Christ would come, I specifically thought of Deuteronomy chapter is it 18 or 19? I think it's 18, but I have on my notes 19. I'm quite certain that that's a typo, but let me just go ahead and go to it. Deuteronomy chapter 18, beginning at verse 15. Yes, it is chapter 18. The Lord thy God shall raise up to thee a prophet from the midst of thee and of thy brethren, like unto me, and to him ye shall hearken. According to all that thou desirest of thy Lord thy God in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, let me not see his great fire any more, that I die not. And the Lord said unto me, they have well spoken that which they have spoken. And I will raise them up a prophet among their brethren, like unto thee, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall not hearken unto my words, which he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him. Then there's the test of the prophet that follows. Point being that this is at least one location where Moses specifically talked about the Messiah that should come. Paul was undoubtedly mentioning and thinking of that as he made that statement in this verse. He also said that the prophets mentioned that Christ would suffer. I specifically think of a passage that we often read when we're getting our minds ready for the Lord's Supper. Isaiah chapter 52 and 53, he was smitten, and like a lamb led before the slaughter, he was slaughtered, and yet he made no sound about it. His visage was marred more than any man, and several different statements along in that passage related to his suffering. Somebody call me? Or somebody me? Okay. Somebody else, or Third point he made in there, that he would rise from the dead. I can think of 3 specific prophecies related of the Old Testament related to Christ rising again. In fact, all 3 of them were referenced by Peter in Acts chapter 2 when he began that sermon on the day of Pentecost. They were Psalm 16, 10, and 11, 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 16, and Psalm 110, 1. And finally, that the light would go into the Gentiles. I think of Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, one of those kingdom prophecies we looked at just weeks ago. Mentioned that the law would go forth from Jerusalem and the word from Mount Zion, and it would go into all peoples. And also chapter 62, verse 2. There's various other ones, but I just thought it would be good to just go back, at least that's where I started my study in preparation for this class this week. Now, let's go back then to verse number 27 where we started. King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? Remember, King Agrippa was a man who was renowned as being a scholar of the Jewish scriptures. And so Paul asked him this question, but it was apparently a rhetorical question, because Paul answers his own question. He knew that Agrippa believed. And the point that we made last time I spoke on that was 2 weeks ago, was that from that we can know that King Agrippa was not a Sadducee, because the Sadducees didn't believe the prophets. Paul knows that King Agrippa has knowledge of the prophets and he believes the prophets. And so I think those things also help, at least in my mind, when I get to the question in a few moments about whether or not Agrippa was being sarcastic or serious. Those things lead me in my mind to believe he was quite serious. He knew the scriptures, and he knew Paul was handling the scriptures correctly. I believe that he was serious. But at any rate, verse number 28, and Agrippa said unto Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. Well, this is the second time that the word Christian has appeared in the book of Acts. You might recall that the first time it was chapter 11, verse 26, where they were in the church there at Antioch, and the verse tells us that the disciples began to be called, first there at Antioch, began to be called Christians. As we mentioned before, there is no hint that this word, this name, Christian, is being used in a derogatory fashion. The Jehovah's Witnesses suggest that to be the case. They say that Christian was a name of derision. It wasn't one that Christians adopted themselves. It was one that their enemies and people trying to ridicule them gave them. Well, because I think this stuff is worth repeating. When we look at the word Christian, we've already talked about this at chapter 11, verse 26, but let's look at it again. The Greek word translated Christian, it is a compound word of Christos, which means the anointed one, and the ending Ionos signifies ownership. And so the term Christian literally means those belonging to Christ. There's absolutely nothing derogatory about that word in itself. It is a truth which every follower of Christ should be grateful for. In fact, remember Paul said, ye are not your own, you have been bought with a price. And so this premise is true. We do belong to Christ. And there's no negative connotation about it whatsoever. Neither here nor in the other two occurrences, our present text, or over in 1 Peter, we'll mention that one in just a moment. It's never used in a negative connotation. The Jehovah's Witnesses take this view because they assert that the proper name for God's people is Jehovah's Witnesses. So they have an axe to grind. But their claim is false. It's without any scriptural support. There's not one current occurrence in all the Bible of the phrase Jehovah's Witnesses. But the name Christian has 3 verses, proof texts. The third and final occurrence of the word is found in 1 Peter 4:16, where Peter says, if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on his behalf. He didn't say, if any man suffers being called a Christian. He said, if any man suffers as a Christian. You know, if you think about all the suffering that the first century Christians went through and centuries following, name calling was the least of their worries, okay? That's not what Peter was talking about. People do not, like Peter, do not refer to themselves by derogatory terms that are meant to belittle or criticize. Peter is saying this name Christian, furthermore, it's more significant than those who make these claims even realize. Isaiah chapter 62 verse 2 says, and the Gentiles shall see thy righteousness, and all kings thy glory, and thou shalt be called by a new name, which the mouth of the Lord shall name. And so Acts chapter 11, verse 26, the first time we see that phrase used, think about the context leading up to it. It follows the chapter where God has finally acknowledged that it's time for the Gentiles to be brought into the fold. And the church there at Antioch was the first congregation that was integrated, Jews and Gentiles together. Furthermore, it was taught by the man who was designated to preach to the Gentiles. Can there be any doubt that this is the name that Isaiah spoke that God's people would be called? If this is not the name, it is nowhere to be found in Scripture. Any questions or comments about this? It's liable to come up one day. You know, those Jehovah's Witnesses go door to door knocking, and if they knock on your door and they pose this question to you, I hope you'll be ready to answer this one. All right, now let's look at that phrase, almost thou persuadest me. Of course, we sing a hymn, almost but lost, the hymn goes. That was Agrippa, though, being sarcastic when he asked this question. Greg brought this up last week, or he mentioned it just in passing. It was obvious that he had discovered something along his way as he was studying. And so I did a little more research on this. Translation of this passage is problematic, and that can be seen. The literal translation of this is rough. I wish I would have included it in my notes. It's rough. If you just were to translate it literally without trying to, literally word for word, it's hard to make sense of it. And so as the translators try to add in words, italicized words and whatnot to try to make it understandable when they translate it from one language to the next, different translators have understood this different ways. Some believe that Agrippa is being sincere. The King James reading favors this, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. That sounds like he's serious to me. But others think that Agrippa was being sympathetic to Paul's position, but yet he was not totally convinced. The NIV reading favors this. Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? That's the way the NIV words that. Still others argue that Agrippa was absolutely being sarcastic, and they prefer the RSV reading, which translates it this way. In a short time you think to make me a Christian? And so that one kind of sounds more sarcastic. Well, Roper, one of the commentators that I think a lot of in this study, he says of this, we wish we knew how Agrippa said these words. The tone of his voice, the expression on his face, the posture of his body. But without knowing how Agrippa said these words, we cannot know whether or not he was sincere. However, Bob Winton, he is not willing to concede that point at all. He says, quote, the King James Version is clearly the correct one because it fits Paul's rejoinder in verse 29. Further, the evidence presented by Paul, together with Agrippa's training in the law and knowledge of the events and facts of history, would naturally lead to a conviction of what Paul represented was true. Roper also says, since Agrippa was kindly disposed toward Paul before, throughout, and even after Paul's speech, we can probably eliminate sarcasm as an option. Exactly how near conversion the king was, we will never know. So I'll just go ahead and tell you, I'm of the persuasion that Agrippa believed what he heard. I'm of the persuasion that his knowledge of Jewish matters and things would have led him, and Paul, because Paul was such a good evangelist, I'm of the persuasion that, and also, by the way, Paul answers this in the next verse, which we'll notice. Paul doesn't seem to take it as sarcasm. Paul seems to take it as a sincere statement. And so I'm of the belief that Agrippa did basically the same thing as Felix did here. Even though Felix was convicted, he said, come some more convenient season. He delayed. He postponed what he needed to do, and I believe Agrippa did the very same thing. However, I suppose there's no need to be dogmatic about this, regardless of which response Agrippa gave, whether he did it in seriousness or in sarcasm. Regardless, it wasn't the right one. It wasn't the right response, was it? So perhaps there's no need to be dogmatic about it. Before we leave this verse, I think it's interesting to note that two classes of people are mentioned here: almost Christians and altogether Christians. You know, what stands between almost Christians and altogether Christians is just a moment's decision, but the consequences, eternal consequences. That's what stands between almost Christians and altogether Christians. Moving on to verse number 29, and if you have any questions or comments, raise your hand. Sometimes I don't hear you from up here. And Paul said, I would to God that not only thou, but also all that hear me this day were both almost and altogether such as I am, except these bonds. Whatever Agrippa meant, Paul accepted his words at face value. The fact that Paul seemed to take Agrippa's statement seriously is probably the strongest argument for believing that Agrippa was sincere in what he said. Paul used Agrippa's words and made a very powerful and eloquent appeal to everyone present that day. Paul wished that everyone within the sound of his voice would be a Christian, not almost be a Christian, but would altogether be persuaded to be a Christian. He wished that everyone there was as zealous as he was, or was like he was, except in the case of him, those chains, those shackles that were around his hands and feet. Except in that particular point, he wished everybody there were just as he was. Verse 30, and when he had thus spoken, the king rose up, and the governor and Bernice, and they sat with him. And when they were gone aside, they talked between themselves, saying, This man doeth nothing worthy of death, nor of bonds. Then said Agrippa unto Festus, This man might have been set at liberty, if he had not appealed to Caesar. And so again, I've lost count. How many times? Again, Paul has been declared not guilty. And as Agrippa said, he should have been set at liberty. Luke has gathered, if you think about, again, the context of Luke writing this, he's writing to this man, most noble Theophilus, who was likely a Roman official himself. Luke has gathered quite a few official statements for Theophilus to consider about Paul's trials and the accusations leveled against him. What Agrippa doesn't know, though, is that the only reason that Paul appealed to Caesar is because his case was being mishandled by corruption. Both Felix and Festus were corrupted, trying to appeal to the Jews for personal reasons. They let a man remain in jail for 2 years and have to travel all the way to Rome and stand before Caesar for their own purposes, so that they could endear themselves to the Jews. Of course, there's one other thing for us to consider here, and that is it's also God's will that Paul should go to Rome. Remember Acts chapter 23, verse 11? And the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, Be of good cheer, Paul, for thou hast testified unto me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also in Rome. And so this is falling out according to the providence of God, regardless of what corrupt decisions evil men have made. That brings us to the end of chapter 26. Ready for chapter 27. But any questions on chapter 26 before we move on? Okay, chapter 27. I have an outline on the screen behind me. I thought a good way to break this one up was as they travel from one location to the next, but then I also put just a little hint of some of the things that happen from each one location to the next in there. And so chapter overview here, this chapter gives the account of Paul's journey to Rome so that he can stand before Caesar. This voyage under optimal conditions might have been made in just a few weeks, but because of the time of year that it was, because of the terrible weather conditions, because of a storm at sea which resulted in their shipwreck, it actually takes them months to make this journey. Luke records every stop along the way of this voyage. You know, a lot of times Luke gives us the Cliff Notes version, but for some reason, in this particular account, he goes through he's very detailed. Tells us every little individual stop that they made and every little trial that they faced, seemingly. And so Luke's inclusion of this account was likely twofold. One, to tell us how Paul got to Rome. And I think number two, perhaps to show us how Satan tried to prevent Paul from getting to Rome. You remember when Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, he said that he desired to see them and would like to have come, but Satan hindered us. That was 1 Thessalonians 2, 17 and 18. You know, Satan hindered Paul from doing a lot of things throughout his missionary journeys. And if Satan was concerned about preventing Paul from getting to Thessalonica, if he was concerned about, how much more would he be concerned about Paul getting to the capital of the world, Rome? A man like Paul, with the influence that he had, I think Satan has a lot more to lose than he has to gain by that situation. And so I believe the recording of these events here might be twofold: to show how Paul got to Rome and show how Satan tried to prevent Paul from getting to Rome. And so the outline on the screen, the journey begins from Caesarea to Sidon, verses 1 through 3. All right, beginning verse 1. And when it was determined that we should sail unto Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus's band. And so Paul is placed on a ship. The destination of the ship is Italy. Julius is the officer in charge. He is a centurion. A centurion was a soldier that was given charge over 100 troops. At least originally, some sources say that by the first century that number had been reduced to 80. So whether it's 80 or 100 troops, this was a man with some fairly decent rank in the Roman army. He was of a band or a cohort. Some translations say cohort, some say band. If we were to use more modern terminology, we might say a unit. What unit do you belong to? What division do you belong? What company were you in? We hear military people today use that terminology. Same situation here, band, cohort. It was a regiment consisting of between 600 and 1,000 men. His band is identified as Augustus's band. You might remember that Cornelius was a member of the Italian band. Now, the Augustan cohort or band had some connection with Augustus, or the August one, that is the emperor. Perhaps this was an imperial cohort whose officers were men who traveled throughout the empire on escort missions or courier duties. At any rate, this man that was in charge here, this centurion, he has a lot of authority, as you can see throughout this journey, the decisions made and how he seems to make all the final decisions. This is a man of authority. Julius is thankfully very friendly towards Paul throughout the voyage. We'll notice that in verse number 3. He allowed him some freedom at Sidon to go to some of his friends' homes and shower, shave, eat a hot meal, whatever things he needed to do there. And also, later on, during the shipwreck, when some of the soldiers thought that they should put the prisoners to death, he spoke up for Paul's sake and prevented that from happening. And so thankfully, Paul has a friend in this man. Paul is not the only prisoner, this verse informs us on this. He's not the only prisoner on this voyage. In Paul's case, the term prisoner sounds a little harsh. In reality, he was merely in custody. He had not really done anything wrong. He had not been sentenced. But it very well could be the case that the other prisoners on board were convicted criminals being sent to Rome so that they could be thrown to wild beasts for the amusement of crowds. That suggestion is somewhat supported later on by the fact that when the ship wrecked, the soldiers went out and were getting ready to put all the prisoners to death. And so that would suggest then that these men had already been sentenced to death. Roper notes that the date of this ship's departure can be very closely estimated to August of 59 AD. August of 59 AD. How does he come up with that? The year 59 AD agrees with the chronology in connection with, remember, Felix has just left office and Festus has just started his tenure. And so 59 AD correlates with that, and then the date also agrees with verse number 9. A fast is mentioned, which is a reference to the Day of Atonement. And so the month of August is derived from the fact that fast, the Day of Atonement, is mentioned in verse 9, and then estimating back the amount of time on the journey from working back from verse 9 to here, come up with August 59, folks. That may not be perfect, but I think that's pretty close, as close as we need it. Verse number 2, and entering into a ship of Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coasts of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. And so the ship was from Adramyttium, a seaport on the western end of Asia Minor in the province of Mysia. It was not far from Troas. It was apparently on its journey back to its port of origin. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, accompanied Paul. Now we've read this name before. He was one of the men who accompanied Paul on his journey to Jerusalem. Acts chapter 20, verse 4. He is often also later spoken of in one of those prison epistles, Colossians 4:10, as a fellow prisoner with Paul. But since he's named separately here from Paul and separately from the other prisoners, it might be the case that he wasn't necessarily a prisoner in the sense of that word, but perhaps he was accompanying Paul and was a prisoner because he was there with Paul, supporting Paul. We don't really know the details there, but we also know from the pronoun we in this verse that Luke is also with Paul on this journey. So we have Luke, we have Aristarchus, and we have Paul mentioned. Verse number 3. And the next day we touched Sidon, and Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go into his friends to refresh himself. Having a map of Paul's journey to Rome on the screen behind me now, and so we can trace this journey as we make it. See, Sidon was directly north along the coast, a distance of about 67 miles. There must have been somewhat of a layover before the ship was going to depart again, and Julius kindly allows Paul the freedom to go into the city where he had friends to receive him. Paul had made earlier trips through this region. Chapter 12, verse 25. Phoenicia in particular is mentioned in chapter 15, verse 3 of Paul's journeys. And he had also spoken at nearby Tyre on his way to Jerusalem, chapter 21, verse 3 and 4. So Paul certainly knew people in this area. Most of the prisoners would have remained chained below deck while in the port. But Paul was shown this extreme kindness, probably for reasons including that he was a Roman citizen, Perhaps the centurion had knowledge of Paul's particular case, thus knowing that he wasn't a true criminal, he wasn't a flight risk. Festus might have even explained to Julius that Paul was an uncondemned Roman citizen who should be given preferential treatment. Then we come to the next section of our outline. I'll go back to the map. From Sidon to Myra, where the crew will change ships when getting to Myra. All right, and when we had launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. And so first of all, I want us to notice the phrase that the winds were contrary. Because of this, the ship sailed under Cyprus. Now the phrasing of that might give us the wrong idea, making it sound as if they sailed south under the island of Cyprus. And as you see on the screen behind me, that's not what's displayed on that screen. Did the people who did this map, is that wrong, or is there something else? There's something else. The phrase sailed under Cyprus is better understood by the added italicized words in the New King James Version, sailed under the shelter of Cyprus. The NIV uses a nautical term here, to the lee of. To the lee of means the side sheltered from the wind. You see, the prevailing winds in the summer were from the west, and so ships aren't made to sail into the wind. They're made to be carried by the wind, and so they could not sail directly into the Mediterranean. Therefore, they sailed along the coast. Luke mentions Cilicia and Pamphylia, which are, as you see here, right here along the coast line. And so they sailed along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia and Pamphylia on the north, and they used the island of Cyprus as a natural windbreak to the south. McGarvey notes that an additional reason for taking this track may have been the desire to take advantage of a current which flows westward along the southward shore of Asia Minor as far as Archipelago, and greatly favors the progress of westward bound vessels. Well, that made me decide, hey, I want to pull up a little map and see if I can find where these currents are. And I found one. Looky there. There's the current. Goes right up the coast here, exactly on the route which the Bible tells us they took. And so it seems that not only were they avoiding these westerly winds here, they were taking advantage of the that about jarred my teeth. I don't know about you guys. All right. And so in regard to that phrase, the winds were contrary, we understand that Paul was heading to Rome in accordance with God's stated purpose. And yet he encountered contrary winds. I think there's an application there. As all experienced travelers of life well know, we all face contrary winds from time to time. And just because we are facing contrary winds does not mean that we are outside the will of God. In fact, one who is doing the will of God will often find himself going against the wind. But they did finally arrive at Myra, a city in the Roman province of Lycia. This little elbow or knee-shaped round area right here is Lycia. It's a small province, just about the shape of that circle I drew. That's about the size of that province. It is estimated that it took them a couple weeks to make that trip from Sidon to Myra. That doesn't look like a very long distance, but the problem was the western wind was causing their progress to be so slow. Myra was a principal port on the route of grain ships that would travel from Egypt to Rome. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean world. They were known for their grain production. You might think back in Joseph's day, remember what caused Joseph to rise to the position of power he had? Because he interpreted that dream and he come up with that idea to store the grain in the silos during the 7 years of plenty. And so during the 7 years of famine, they would have plenty. Well, Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean world. Ships were constantly sending grain through the Mediterranean Sea and then over to Rome. They did not go west across the sea. As we mentioned, the winds blowing from the west prevented it, and so what they would do is they would follow the coastline, or they might make it north through here, but then they would eventually go work their way westward to Rome. Ships, this was one of those ships. He says a ship from Alexandria. Alexandria is a major city of Egypt, I believe the capital of Egypt at this time, and the Roman centurion secured them a ship from Egypt to put them on. Now, these grain ships, they were huge. One ancient historian told of one such ship that was 180 feet long by 45 feet wide and 43 feet tall. Josephus wrote of another ship which carried 600 persons in addition to its cargo. The ship on which Paul sailed was able to accommodate 276 people in addition to its cargo, as is mentioned later on in the text. This brings us to the third section that Luke mentions of their trip, from Myra to Fair Havens. Verse number 7. And when we had sailed slowly many days, and it doesn't tell us how many days, but many days. The wind is fierce. This is slow going. And scarce were come over against Sindus, the wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete and over against Salome, and hardly passing it, came into a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereunto was a city of Lasa. The winds were so strong, in other words, that this trip was slow going. By the time they got to Sindus, which was 130 miles west of Myra, 130 miles, and yet it took many days to go 130 miles. The wind would not let them sail any further, so they changed their heading to southwest and sailed between the island of Crete and Salome, sailing around the island of Crete, along its shore. Now, as they're going around this southern shore of Crete, they don't have any protection from the winds now. Now these fierce winds are trying to drive them into the island, and so they make port at Fair Havens, just 1.5 miles from Lasa. We will stop right there and pick up at verse number 9 next week. I appreciate your attention. Mm-hmm.